A Hell's Angel took the bullet meant for a homeless girl. What happened next shocked the town. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The gunshot echoed across the quiet parking lot behind a small roadside bar on the edge of Cedar Ridge, a town where most nights ended with the distant hum of pickup trucks and the flicker of neon signs glowing over empty streets. But on this cold evening, something happened that no one in that town would ever forget. A teenage homeless girl named Lily Carter stood frozen beside a rusted dumpster, clutching a worn backpack that held everything she owned in the world. She had been trying to slip quietly through the alley behind the bar, hoping to find a dry corner where she could sit out the night wind that rolled down from the hills. Instead, she had walked straight into trouble. 3 men blocked her path, their voices low and threatening as they demanded the little money she carried. Lily had already learned that life on the streets meant staying quiet and avoiding attention, but fear had tightened her chest until breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting toward the narrow opening that led back to the street, but one of the men stepped forward and raised a handgun with a careless grin. That was the moment a deep rumble rolled into the alley like distant thunder. A motorcycle engine. The sound grew louder, then cut suddenly into silence. Heavy boots touched the pavement. A tall man stepped into the dim light spilling from the bar's back door. His leather vest carried the unmistakable patch of a Hell's Angel. The man was Daniel Reaper Hayes, a biker whose reputation had traveled through Cedar Ridge for years. People crossed the street when they saw him. Store owners watched him through the windows as he passed. Parents warned their children to stay away from men like him. Yet in that moment, Daniel Hayes did not look at the frightened girl the way the others did. He looked at her the way a man might look at someone who reminded him of something he had lost long ago. The men laughed when they saw him standing alone. One of them told him to mind his own business. Another raised the gun higher, waving it carelessly in Lily's direction as if her life meant nothing at all. The wind rattled an old metal sign above the alley, and for a brief second the entire world seemed to pause. Daniel Hayes took one slow step forward. His voice was calm, steady, and cold as winter steel when he spoke. "Leave the girl alone." The men laughed again. None of them noticed Lily trembling behind him. None of them noticed the quiet determination in the biker's eyes. And none of them understood that within the next few seconds the entire town of Cedar Ridge would witness a moment that would change the way they saw that feared Hell's Angel forever. Lily Carter could barely breathe as the tension in the narrow alley thickened like storm clouds before lightning. The wind pushed loose paper across the cracked pavement while the neon sign above the bar flickered red and blue across the walls. Daniel Reaper Hayes stood between her and the 3 men as if the position had always belonged to him. Up close, he seemed even larger than Lily first thought, his shoulders broad beneath the worn leather vest, and his boots planted firmly on the ground. The patch on his back was unmistakable even in the dim light. Hell's Angels. The name alone had the power to make people nervous in Cedar Ridge. Lily had heard whispers about men like him during the months she had been drifting from town to town. People said they were dangerous. People said they brought trouble wherever they rode. But in that moment, Daniel Hayes did not move like a man looking for trouble. He moved like someone who had made a quiet decision that could not be undone. The man holding the handgun tilted his head and stared at Daniel with a crooked grin. He was tall and thin with a greasy jacket and eyes that carried the restless impatience of someone used to getting his way. His 2 friends stood beside him, blocking the only path that led back toward the street. One of them kicked Lily's backpack across the pavement and laughed when it landed beside a puddle. Daniel glanced briefly at the bag, then back at the men. His eyes were calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that came from years of surviving situations far worse than a dark alley behind a roadside bar. Inside the building, music played faintly, and someone shouted over a game of pool, completely unaware of what was unfolding only a few yards away. The man with the handgun lifted it slightly and pointed it toward Daniel's chest, as if the gesture meant nothing at all. His voice was mocking when he spoke. He said the biker should climb back on his motorcycle and ride away before things turned ugly. Daniel did not step back. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he shifted slightly, so that Lily stood completely behind him, shielded from the men by his broad frame. Lily watched his back with wide, frightened eyes. She had spent months learning how to read people on the street. She knew when someone meant harm. She knew when someone was pretending to help. But something about the way this man stood in front of her felt different. He did not look at her with pity. He did not look at her with anger. He simply stood there as if protecting her was the most natural thing in the world. One of the other men snorted and stepped closer. He said the girl did not belong to the biker and that whatever happened in this alley was none of his business. Daniel answered in the same steady voice he used before. He said that nobody was going to hurt the girl tonight. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. The man with the handgun laughed loudly now, glancing at his friends as if inviting them to enjoy the moment. He took a slow step forward until the muzzle of the weapon pointed directly at the center of Daniel's chest. Lily felt her stomach twist with fear. The biker did not move. The wind lifted the edge of his leather vest, and for a brief moment the patch on his back caught the flickering light again. Daniel Reaper Hayes stood there like a wall that refused to fall. And somewhere deep, in Lily's mind, a thought appeared that she had not felt in a very long time. For the first time since she had begun sleeping on sidewalks and bus station benches, she felt the fragile spark of something that almost felt like safety. But the men in front of them had no intention of backing down. The one holding the handgun curled his fingers slowly around the trigger while his grin faded into something colder. In the stillness of that alley, everyone understood that the next second would decide everything. The alley remained frozen in a heavy silence that seemed to stretch longer with every passing second. The man holding the handgun stared at Daniel Reaper Hayes as if trying to understand why the biker had not stepped aside like everyone else usually did. Most people backed away when they saw trouble. Most people pretended they had seen nothing. But Daniel Hayes was not moving at all. His boots were planted firmly on the cracked pavement, and his broad shoulders blocked the narrow space between the frightened girl and the three men. Lily Carter stood directly behind him, clutching the sleeve of her worn jacket as she tried to keep her hands from shaking. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The man with the handgun let out a short laugh that sounded forced now, as if the moment had stopped being amusing. He waved the weapon slightly, while speaking in a voice that tried to sound confident. He said that this was the biker's last chance to walk away. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly over his shoulder toward Lily. For the first time since stepping into the alley, his expression softened slightly. His voice was calm and quiet when he spoke to her. He told her to stay behind him and not to move no matter what happened next. The words were simple, but they carried the steady reassurance of someone who had faced danger many times before. Lily nodded, even though she was not sure he could see her. Something about the way he spoke made her believe him. Then Daniel turned back toward the three men. The wind pushed a loose newspaper across the ground, and it scraped softly along the pavement before catching against the wall. The biker stepped forward once. It was not a large movement, but it was enough to change the balance of the moment. Now he stood even closer to the man holding the gun, close enough that the barrel pointed squarely at the center of his chest. Daniel's voice was still calm when he spoke again. He said that nobody needed to get hurt tonight. He said the men could walk away and forget they had ever seen the girl. The thin man holding the gun stared at him for a long moment. His eyes flicked down toward the biker's vest and the patch that marked him as a member of the Hell's Angels. The two men beside him shifted uneasily now. The confidence they carried earlier had begun to crack. They were used to easy victims. They were used to people who ran away when threatened. But this man in front of them was not acting afraid at all. The thin man seemed to sense his friend's hesitation, and his expression hardened. He lifted the handgun a little higher and took another step forward until the distance between him and Daniel was only a few feet. His voice turned sharp as he demanded that the biker move aside. Daniel did not move. His face remained steady and unreadable. For a brief moment, Lily noticed something in his eyes that she could not fully understand. It was not anger. It was not fear. It looked more like a memory passing quietly behind his gaze. Somewhere inside Daniel Hayes, something old and painful had stirred awake. Perhaps it was the sight of a frightened teenager standing alone in a dark alley. Perhaps it was the memory of someone else who had once needed protection and never received it. Whatever the reason, Daniel had already made his choice. The man holding the handgun must have realized that as well, because his grin slowly disappeared. The alley felt colder now. The wind stopped moving for a moment, and even the faint music from the bar inside seemed to fade away. Lily felt time stretching thin around them, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then the thin man tightened his finger on the trigger. Daniel Hayes did not step back. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he shifted his body slightly, so that Lily remained completely hidden behind him. His shoulders squared and his stance grew firm like a man preparing to face a storm head-on. In that instant, Lily understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. This stranger had decided that her life mattered more than his own safety. And before anyone could say another word, the night shattered with the explosive crack of a gunshot echoing through the narrow alley. The gunshot exploded through the alley like a clap of thunder that shattered the fragile silence of the night. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to stop. The sound bounced off the brick walls and metal dumpsters, echoing into the empty street beyond the bar. Lily Carter flinched so violently that her knees nearly gave out beneath her. The smell of burned gunpowder hung in the cold air. The thin man who fired the weapon stared forward with wide eyes, as if even he had not fully expected the moment to happen. But Daniel Reaper Hayes was still standing. The impact struck his body with a dull force that pushed his shoulders slightly backward, yet his boots did not slide across the pavement. The biker did not fall. Instead, he drew a slow breath through clenched teeth and remained planted firmly between Lily and the men who had threatened her only seconds earlier. For a moment, the alley looked like a photograph frozen in time. The gun remained pointed forward. The two other men stood motionless with stunned expressions. And Daniel Hayes stood in front of the girl like an immovable wall. Lily felt the world tilt around her as fear surged through her chest. She could not see exactly what had happened, but she saw Daniel's body tense, and she heard the sharp breath he pulled into his lungs. A dark stain slowly began spreading across the front of his shirt beneath the edge of his leather vest. The thin man holding the handgun blinked as if trying to process what he had just done. His earlier confidence had vanished. This had been supposed to be a simple threat meant to scare a homeless teenager into handing over the few dollars she carried. Instead, he had fired a real shot into the chest of a Hell's Angels biker who refused to step aside. One of his friends whispered something under his breath that sounded like sudden panic. The alley no longer felt like a place they controlled. It felt like a trap closing around them. Daniel finally moved. Not backward, but forward. One step. Slow and steady. The movement was so unexpected that the man with the gun instinctively stumbled half a step away. The biker's face was pale, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination that made the moment even more unsettling. He raised one hand slowly and pressed it against his chest where the dark stain continued to spread. His voice when he spoke was rough but steady. He told the men again to leave. The words carried a weight that made the two men beside the gunman glance nervously toward the street. Lily could hear her own breathing growing faster behind him. She wanted to say something, but the shock had locked the words inside her throat. The thin man lifted the gun again, but this time his hands trembled slightly. The situation had changed in a way he did not understand. The biker should have fallen. The biker should have been helpless on the ground. But Daniel Hayes was still standing. Worse than that, he was walking toward them as if pain meant nothing at all. Another step brought him closer. His boots struck the pavement with slow, heavy thuds that seemed to echo louder than the music inside the bar. The two men beside the gunman looked at each other with growing unease. Something about the scene had shifted beyond their control. In the distance, another sound began to drift toward the alley. At first it was faint and barely noticeable beneath the ringing echo of the gunshot. But within seconds it grew stronger. The deep rumbling sound of motorcycle engines. Not just one. Several. The thin man with the handgun turned his head slightly toward the street as the sound rolled closer, like distant thunder building across the hills. Daniel Hayes stopped walking and lifted his eyes toward the alley entrance where the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The rumble of approaching engines grew louder with every passing second. And suddenly the three men understood something that made the color drain from their faces. Daniel Hayes had not come to this bar alone tonight. The rumble of approaching motorcycles rolled through the narrow alley like distant thunder moving across the hills outside Cedar Ridge. The sound grew louder with every passing second until the pavement itself seemed to vibrate beneath the boots of the men standing there. The three attackers froze as the realization settled over them. That sound meant trouble. Real trouble. The thin man holding the handgun glanced toward the mouth of the alley where the dim streetlight cast a pale glow across the road. His earlier confidence had drained away completely now. Even his grip on the weapon had weakened. Beside him, the other two men shifted nervously as the rumbling engines grew closer. Daniel Reaper Hayes remained standing exactly where he was. His breathing had become slower and heavier now, but his posture still blocked the path to Lily Carter behind him. The dark stain spreading across his shirt beneath the leather vest had grown larger, but he did not look down at it again. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the men in front of him. Lily could see the tension in his shoulders. She could see the effort it took for him to remain standing. Yet he still did not move aside. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder until it filled the entire street beyond the alley. Then one by one the engines began to slow. Tires rolled across loose gravel. The deep mechanical growl faded into a heavy idle that echoed against the brick buildings. The thin man swallowed hard. He turned his head toward the alley entrance just as the first motorcycle appeared under the streetlight. A large touring bike rolled slowly into view. Its chrome surfaces reflected the pale glow of the lamp above. The rider wore a leather vest identical to the one Daniel wore. The Hells Angels patch stood clearly across the rider's back. Behind that first motorcycle came another. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet street beside the bar had filled with several large bikes forming a loose line along the curb. The riders shut off their engines one after another, and the sudden silence that followed felt even heavier than the rumble before it. Boots touched the pavement. Leather creaked softly as the men dismounted their motorcycles. None of them rushed forward. None of them shouted. They simply walked slowly toward the alley entrance where the dim light allowed them to see what had happened. The thin man with the handgun took a step backward without realizing it. His two companions did the same. They could feel the balance of power shifting around them like a tide pulling away from the shore. One of the bikers stepped forward from the street and stopped at the edge of the alley. He was older than the others with gray streaks in his beard and the calm, watchful eyes of someone who had seen more than enough trouble in his life. His gaze moved across the scene slowly. First, he looked at the three men standing with the gun. Then he looked at Daniel Hayes standing in front of the girl. The older biker's expression hardened when he saw the spreading stain on Daniel's shirt. His voice was low when he spoke, but it carried easily through the silent alley. He asked who had fired the weapon. None of the three men answered. The thin man tightened his grip on the handgun, but his confidence had disappeared. Around him, the other bikers had begun stepping quietly into the alley behind their friend. They did not rush forward or raise their voices. They simply filled the narrow space with calm, deliberate movements until the three attackers realized they were no longer facing one man. They were surrounded by the brotherhood that stood behind him. Daniel finally shifted his weight slightly, as if the effort of remaining upright had grown heavier. The older biker stepped forward quickly then and placed a steady hand against Daniel's shoulder to keep him balanced. His voice softened as he spoke to his injured friend. He told Daniel to stay still. Lily stood behind them with wide eyes as the reality of what had happened finally settled in. Moments earlier, she had been alone and helpless in a dark alley. Now a line of powerful motorcycles filled the street, and a group of hardened riders stood quietly between her and the men who had threatened her life. The thin man with the handgun slowly lowered the weapon. The confidence that once filled his voice had completely vanished. Because he finally understood something that could not be undone. The man he had shot was not just another stranger who had stepped into the wrong alley at the wrong time. The man he had shot was a Hells Angel whose brothers had just arrived. The narrow alley had fallen into a tense and unnatural silence. The three men who had cornered Lily Carter only minutes earlier now stood frozen as the line of Hells Angels bikers slowly filled the space behind Daniel Reaper Hayes. The rumble of engines had faded, but the presence of the riders carried a quiet weight that pressed against the walls of the alley. No one rushed forward. No one shouted. The calm discipline of the group made the moment even more intimidating. The older biker who had stepped forward to steady Daniel kept his hand firmly on his shoulder, helping him remain upright. Up close, he could see the dark stain spreading beneath the leather vest, and his jaw tightened as the reality settled in. Daniel had taken the bullet square in the chest to shield the girl standing behind him. The older rider glanced down briefly, then back toward the three men holding the weapon. His voice was calm, but carried a deep authority when he spoke. He said that someone needed to explain what had just happened. The thin man with the handgun looked from one biker to another. The confidence he carried earlier had vanished completely. Around him, the other riders stood in a loose half circle. Some folded their arms across their chests. Others simply watched with steady eyes. Their silence was far more frightening than shouting would have been. Lily Carter stood behind Daniel and the older biker, her hands trembling as she clutched the sleeve of her jacket. She had never been surrounded by so many intimidating men in her life. Yet none of the bikers looked at her with hostility. In fact, several of them glanced toward her with quiet concern before turning their attention back to the three attackers. The older rider finally spoke Daniel's name softly. He asked if Daniel could still stand. Daniel Hayes nodded slowly, even though the effort seemed to drain the remaining strength from his body. His voice was rough but steady when he answered. He said that the girl was not hurt. That was the first thing he had checked even after the shot. Lily felt a sudden tightness in her chest when she heard those words. Even after being shot, he had worried about her safety first. The older biker gave a slow nod, as if acknowledging the meaning behind that simple statement. Then he turned again toward the thin man holding the gun. His expression hardened noticeably. He asked the man one more time who had fired the weapon. This time the answer came quickly. One of the other attackers stepped half a pace away from the thin man and pointed toward him with shaking hands. Fear had finally broken their loyalty to each other. The thin man cursed under his breath and lowered the handgun slightly as the attention of the entire group settled on him. The older biker took one calm step forward. His boots made a slow, heavy sound against the pavement. The thin man instinctively backed up until his shoulders touched the cold brick wall behind him. The handgun lowered another inch. The older rider spoke again in the same steady voice. He said that nobody needed to make another mistake tonight. He told the man to place the weapon on the ground. For a moment, the thin man looked as if he might refuse. His eyes darted toward the alley entrance as though considering escape. But the line of motorcycles outside and the riders filling the alley made that impossible. Slowly and reluctantly, he bent his arm downward and placed the handgun on the pavement where it landed with a dull metallic sound. One of the bikers stepped forward and nudged the weapon away with the toe of his boot. The tension in the alley shifted slightly, but the atmosphere remained heavy. The older biker then looked back toward Daniel Hayes. Daniel's breathing had grown deeper and slower now, and his weight leaned more heavily against the support on his shoulder. The older rider called out quietly to another member of the group and told him to call for medical help. Several of the bikers immediately pulled out their phones while others moved closer to help keep Daniel steady. Lily stood just behind them, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Only minutes earlier she had believed she might not survive the night. Now a group of hardened riders were working together to keep the man who protected her alive. And for the first time since the gunshot echoed through the alley, the thin man who had fired the weapon realized that the real consequences of his actions had only just begun. The cold air in the alley felt heavier with every passing minute as the group of Hell's Angels riders gathered around Daniel Reaper Hayes. The older biker who had been steadying him kept one strong hand on Daniel's shoulder while another rider carefully supported his other side. Daniel remained standing, but it was clear that the effort was beginning to drain the strength from his body. His breathing was slow and deep, each breath taken with visible control as he fought to remain conscious. Lily Carter stood a few steps behind them, her heart still racing from everything that had happened. She could not take her eyes off the man who had stepped in front of a gun for her. The reality of it had still not fully settled into her mind. The older biker finally turned his attention back to Lily. His voice was calm when he spoke to her, far gentler than the intimidating appearance of the riders might have suggested. He asked if she was hurt. Lily shook her head quickly. Her voice trembled slightly as she answered that she was not injured. The older rider gave a small nod of relief and then looked back toward Daniel. For a moment, the older biker studied Daniel's face carefully. They had ridden together for years, and he knew the signs of when a man was fighting to stay on his feet through pain. Daniel Hayes had always been stubborn, but tonight that stubbornness might be the only thing keeping him standing. The older rider quietly called out to another member of the group who had already dialed for emergency medical help. The man nodded and confirmed that an ambulance had been requested and was on the way. The news brought a small sense of urgency to the group. Several bikers stepped closer, forming a loose protective circle around Daniel and Lily, while others kept their attention fixed on the three men who had caused the entire situation. The thin man who had fired the weapon stood pressed against the brick wall, his earlier arrogance replaced by silent fear. None of the bikers touched him, but their watchful presence made it clear that he was not going anywhere. Daniel shifted slightly as the strength in his legs began to weaken. The older rider tightened his grip to keep him steady. Daniel lifted his head slowly and looked over his shoulder toward Lily again. Even through the pain, there was a quiet focus in his eyes as if he needed to be sure of something. Lily stepped forward a little, unsure of what to do, but unable to remain still any longer. When their eyes met, Daniel spoke in a low voice that carried just enough strength to reach her. He asked if she was truly safe. The question struck Lily harder than anything else that had happened that night. She nodded again, her voice barely steady as she told him yes. For a brief moment, the tension in Daniel's expression softened. That single answer seemed to give him the reassurance he needed. The older biker watched this exchange carefully. He had known Daniel long enough to understand that his friend did not act without reason. Something about the frightened teenager had triggered a response deep inside him. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was regret. Whatever the reason, Daniel had chosen to stand between her and danger without hesitation. The distant wail of approaching sirens finally broke through the night air beyond the alley. The sound echoed faintly down the empty street, growing louder with every passing moment. Several bikers turned their heads toward the road where the flashing lights would soon appear. The older rider spoke quietly to the group and instructed two men to guide the ambulance into the alley when it arrived. Meanwhile, he kept one steady arm around Daniel's shoulders to prevent him from collapsing. Lily watched the scene with wide eyes as the minutes passed. The man who had taken the bullet for her still refused to fall. He remained standing among his brothers while the sound of the approaching ambulance grew closer. And somewhere deep inside Lily Carter, a feeling began to rise that she had not experienced in a very long time. It was the fragile beginning of gratitude, and something even deeper than that. Because she knew that without Daniel Reaper Hayes, she would not be standing in that alley at all. The distant sirens grew louder as the flashing lights of the ambulance finally appeared at the far end of the quiet street outside the bar. The sound echoed off the buildings and rolled down into the narrow alley where the group of Hell's angels stood around Daniel Reaper Hayes. Two of the riders immediately stepped toward the street to guide the emergency vehicle into position. The rest of the bikers remained exactly where they were, forming a silent barrier between Daniel, Lily Carter, and the three men who had started the entire nightmare. The thin man who had fired the weapon had not moved from the brick wall where fear had pushed him earlier. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes kept shifting between the bikers and the approaching lights. The other two men stood beside him in silence, their earlier confidence gone completely. None of them tried to run. The presence of the riders made escape feel impossible. The older biker supporting Daniel adjusted his grip slightly as Daniel's strength began to fade. Daniel was still standing, but the effort had become painfully obvious. His breathing had grown heavier, and his weight leaned more firmly against the arm holding him steady. Yet, even in that moment, his attention shifted again toward the girl behind him. Lily had moved closer without realizing it. She now stood only a few feet away, her small frame dwarfed by the line of leather-clad riders surrounding her. The flashing lights from the ambulance washed across the alley walls in slow pulses of red and white. For the first time that night, Lily saw Daniel's face clearly under the harsh light. His skin had grown pale, but his eyes remained focused and alert. When he noticed Lily watching him, he managed a faint expression that was almost reassuring. It was not a smile, but it carried the same quiet message. She was safe. The ambulance rolled to a stop beside the alley entrance, and the back door swung open almost immediately. Two paramedics jumped down and hurried toward the group carrying their medical equipment. They slowed slightly when they realized how many bikers were gathered there, but the older rider quickly stepped forward and waved them in. His voice remained calm as he explained that a man had been shot and needed immediate help. The paramedics moved quickly once they reached Daniel. One of them carefully examined the wound while the other prepared equipment from a large medical bag. The bikers stepped back just enough to give them room to work, but none of them left the alley. The thin man with the gun watched the scene unfold with growing dread. The flashing lights from the ambulance and the distant sound of another approaching siren suggested that law enforcement would not be far behind. The older biker glanced briefly toward the street as if he had come to the same conclusion. but his focus returned immediately to Daniel. The paramedics spoke quietly with each other as they worked. After a brief moment, they carefully guided Daniel onto a stretcher while the older biker kept a steady hand near his shoulder to help support him. Daniel finally allowed his body to relax as they lowered him down. The effort of remaining upright was over. As they prepared to lift the stretcher toward the ambulance, Daniel turned his head slightly one more time toward Lily Carter. She stepped forward instinctively until she stood beside the stretcher. The paramedics did not stop her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily could see the exhaustion in his eyes now, but she also saw the same steady determination that had brought him into the alley earlier that night. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. She told him that he had saved her life. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something simple and obvious. His voice was low and rough, but the words were clear. He told her that nobody deserved to be left alone in a dark alley. The paramedics began pushing the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance while the group of Hell's Angels walked beside them in silent support. Behind them, the three men who had started everything stood frozen under the flashing lights as the consequences of their actions closed in around them. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the quiet street outside the bar. Red and white lights continued to flash across the brick walls and pavement as the paramedics climbed into the vehicle and began preparing Daniel Reaper Hayes for transport. One of the Hell's Angels riders stepped back from the ambulance while another quietly spoke with the paramedic through the open side window. Within seconds, the engine roared to life again. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street towards Cedar Ridge Memorial Hospital. The remaining bikers stood silently for a moment as the sound of the ambulance faded into the distance. For many of them, Daniel had been a brother for years. Seeing him carried away on a stretcher had settled a heavy silence over the group. The older rider who had helped support Daniel during the worst of the bleeding finally turned back toward Lily Carter. She still stood near the alley entrance where the flashing lights had illuminated the entire scene only moments earlier. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but she had not moved away. The older biker studied her quietly for a moment before speaking. His voice remained calm and steady when he asked if she had anywhere safe to go tonight. Lily hesitated before answering. The truth had never been easy to explain. She shook her head slowly. Her voice was quiet as she admitted that she did not really have a place anymore. The older biker did not seem surprised by that answer. His eyes softened slightly as he nodded in understanding. He asked her to sit down on the curb for a moment while they waited for the police officers who were already on their way. Lily obeyed without argument. Her legs felt weak after everything that had happened. As she sat on the cold pavement, she noticed several of the riders standing nearby. None of them spoke loudly. None of them acted threatening. They simply remained close, forming a quiet, protective presence around her. One of the riders stepped forward and handed her the backpack that had been kicked across the alley earlier. Lily accepted it with a small, grateful nod. A few minutes later, the distant sound of another siren reached the street. This time it was not an ambulance, but a police vehicle arriving to investigate the gunshot that had echoed through Cedar Ridge. The patrol car pulled up beside the bar and two officers stepped out quickly. Their eyes moved across the scene, taking in the line of motorcycles parked along the curb and the group of riders standing near the alley. The thin man who had fired the gun lowered his head slightly when the officers approached. One of the bikers calmly pointed toward the weapon that still lay on the pavement where it had been dropped earlier. The officers moved quickly to secure it before placing the thin man and his two companions in handcuffs. The tension that had filled the alley slowly began to fade now that the attackers were being taken into custody. One of the officers approached Lily and knelt beside her to ask a few careful questions. His tone was gentle as he asked what had happened earlier that night. Lily took a slow breath before answering. She explained that she had been walking behind the bar looking for a quiet place to sit when the three men stopped her. Her voice trembled slightly as she described how they had demanded her backpack and the few dollars she carried inside it. The officer listened carefully without interrupting. Then he asked about the biker who had been taken away by the ambulance. Lily looked down for a moment before answering that question. She told the officer that Daniel Hayes had stepped into the alley and told the men to leave her alone. She explained how he had stood between her and the gun when the man fired the shot. The officer paused for a moment after hearing that part of the story. Even the riders standing nearby grew quieter as the truth settled over the scene again. Lily finished her explanation by looking toward the empty street where the ambulance had disappeared earlier. Her voice was softer when she spoke the final words. She said that the man who had been shot did not even know her name when he decided to stand in front of that gun. And yet he had chosen to protect her anyway. The flashing lights of the police vehicles continued to paint the quiet street in red and blue as the officers finished placing the three men into the back of the patrol cars. The thin man who had fired the weapon no longer looked angry or defiant. His face had gone pale, and his shoulders slumped as the reality of what had happened began to settle over him. A few feet away, Lily Carter remained seated on the curb with her backpack resting beside her boots. The officer who had been speaking with her finished writing several notes in a small notebook before standing up slowly. He thanked her for telling the truth about what had happened and assured her that the men responsible would be taken into custody. Lily nodded quietly, but her attention kept drifting toward the empty street where the ambulance had disappeared earlier. The older Hells Angels rider noticed the direction of her gaze. He stepped a little closer and leaned against the front fender of one of the parked motorcycles. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke in a calm voice that carried the slow tone of someone who had spent years riding long roads with the same group of men beside him. He told Lily that Daniel Hayes was stronger than he looked. He said that Daniel had survived worse situations than most people could imagine. Lily looked up at him with uncertain eyes. She wanted to believe that was true, but the image of Daniel collapsing onto the stretcher still played over and over in her mind. The older rider seemed to understand what she was thinking. He sighed quietly before speaking again. He said that Daniel had once served in the military many years ago before joining the motorcycle club. During those years, he had been sent overseas where he learned how quickly life could change in dangerous places. The older rider explained that Daniel had seen things there that never truly left him. He had lost friends during those years and carried the memory of those losses long after returning home. Lily listened closely without interrupting. The older biker continued by saying that after returning from the military, Daniel had struggled for a long time to find his place again. The motorcycle club had eventually become the closest thing he had to family. The men who stood around the alley that night were not simply riders who enjoyed the open road. They were men who trusted one another with their lives. Lily glanced at the group of bikers standing nearby. Some leaned against their motorcycles while others spoke quietly with the police officers who were finishing their work. For the first time, she began to understand that the intimidating image she had always heard about these men did not tell the entire story. The older rider lowered his voice slightly before adding something else. He explained that many years earlier Daniel had once had a daughter. The little girl had been the center of his world for a short time, but an accident had taken her life while Daniel was away on a long ride. The loss had left a deep mark on him that never truly faded. Lily felt a sudden tightness in her chest when she heard that. It explained something she had sensed earlier in the alley when Daniel looked back to check if she was safe even after being shot. The older biker nodded slowly as if he could see the realization forming in her expression. He told her that when Daniel saw a frightened young person alone, it reminded him of what he had lost. That was why he had stepped forward without hesitation when the gun was raised. Lily lowered her eyes for a moment as the weight of that truth settled over her. The quiet street around the bar had begun returning to normal as the police cars prepared to leave with the suspects. But inside Lily Carter, something had changed forever. A man she had never met had risked his life for her because he refused to let another young life be lost if he had the power to stop it. The police vehicles finally pulled away from the curb, their flashing lights fading into the distance as the quiet street outside the bar slowly returned to normal. The group of Hells Angels riders remained near their motorcycles, speaking quietly among themselves while the night air settled around Cedar Ridge once again. Lily Carter still sat on the curb with her backpack resting against her legs, replaying everything that had happened in her mind. Only a short time earlier, she had been alone in a dark alley, surrounded by men who intended to harm her. Now those same men were on their way to jail, and the man who had stepped in front of the gun for her was fighting for his life at the hospital. The older biker who had been speaking with her earlier remained nearby, watching the street with the patient calm of someone used to waiting through long, uncertain nights. After a moment, he pulled a small phone from his pocket and stepped a few feet away to make a call. Lily could not hear every word, but she understood enough to know he was calling the hospital to check on Daniel Hayes. The other riders waited quietly while he spoke. When the call finally ended, the older biker walked back toward Lily. Several of the men immediately looked toward him, searching his face for any sign of news. For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. The tension that had been building around the group seemed to ease slightly. He explained that Daniel had made it into surgery and the doctors were working to remove the bullet. It would take time before anyone knew the full outcome, but the doctors believed he had arrived at the hospital quickly enough to give him a strong chance of surviving. A quiet wave of relief passed through the riders standing nearby. Some of them lowered their heads for a moment, while others let out long, slow breaths. Lily felt the same sense of relief fill her chest, even though she had only met Daniel a short time earlier. The older biker then looked down toward her again. His voice softened slightly as he spoke. He said that if Daniel could hear what had happened in the alley after he was taken away, he would probably say the same thing he always said. Lily tilted her head slightly in curiosity. The older rider explained that Daniel had always lived by a simple rule. He believed that no child or young person should ever have to face danger alone if someone strong enough was nearby to help. The words struck Lily deeply because she knew that was exactly what he had done. The older biker smiled faintly, as if remembering something from the past. He told her that years earlier Daniel had once said something that stayed with many of the riders who knew him best. He said that when someone younger and frightened looks up at you for help, there are only two choices a person can make. They can walk away or they can stand their ground and protect them. The older biker paused briefly before repeating the words Daniel had spoken in the alley even after being shot. He said that Daniel had whispered the same sentence many times over the years whenever he saw someone in trouble. Nobody hurts kids while I am still breathing. Lily lowered her eyes as the meaning of those words settled into her heart. The quiet street around the bar no longer felt cold or frightening. Instead, it felt like the place where a stranger had chosen to stand up for her when nobody else was there. And as the group of riders began preparing to follow the ambulance to the hospital, Lily Carter realized that the man who had taken a bullet for her had already changed her life in a way she would never forget. The night outside the bar slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm after the police vehicles disappeared down the road. One by one, the Hells Angels riders climbed back onto their motorcycles, the engines rumbling softly to life beneath them. The older biker who had spoken with Lily Carter earlier looked down at her for a moment before speaking again. His voice carried a steady kindness that contrasted with his rugged appearance. He asked if she would like a ride to the hospital. Lily hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She knew there was nowhere else she wanted to go. The group of motorcycles soon pulled away from the curb, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they rode across the sleeping town of Cedar Ridge toward the hospital where Daniel Reaper Hayes was still in surgery. The ride did not take long, but to Lily it felt like a journey between two completely different worlds. Only an hour earlier she had been hiding behind a bar, hoping to avoid trouble. Now she was riding through the quiet streets, surrounded by a group of bikers who had chosen to protect her without asking for anything in return. When they reached Cedar Ridge Memorial Hospital, the motorcycles lined up along the edge of the parking lot. The riders removed their helmets and walked inside together, with Lily following closely behind. The hospital staff looked up with surprise when the group entered the waiting area, but the older biker calmly explained that their friend had just been brought in after being shot while protecting someone. The nurses quickly directed them to the surgical waiting room. Minutes passed slowly as the riders sat or stood in quiet silence. Lily sat near the wall with her backpack on her lap, watching the clock as each second stretched into what felt like a long, uncertain night. Eventually the door opened, and a doctor stepped into the waiting area, still wearing surgical gloves and a mask pulled down around his neck. Every rider in the room stood up at once. The doctor looked at them carefully before speaking. He explained that the surgery had been successful. The bullet had missed Daniel's heart by a small distance, and although the injury had been serious, the doctors believed he would survive. A wave of relief filled the room so quickly that even the hospital staff could feel the change in the atmosphere. Several riders closed their eyes for a moment, while others quietly thanked the doctor. Lily felt her shoulders relax for the first time since the gunshot had echoed through the alley. The doctor continued by explaining that Daniel would remain under observation for several days while he recovered. Visitors would not be allowed to see him immediately, but once he regained consciousness, he would likely be able to receive short visits. The older biker nodded respectfully, and thanked the doctor again before the medical staff returned to their work. The waiting room slowly grew quiet again, but the mood had changed completely. Instead of fear and uncertainty, there was now a calm sense of gratitude. Lily sat quietly for several minutes thinking about everything she had learned that night. She had always believed that people like the Hells Angels were dangerous strangers to be avoided. Yet the men sitting around her had shown patience, kindness, and loyalty in a way she had rarely experienced before. The older biker eventually walked over and sat beside her. He told her that Daniel would be glad to know she was safe. Lily nodded softly. For a long moment, she looked toward the hallway where Daniel was recovering. Somewhere behind those hospital doors, the man who had stepped in front of a gun for her was beginning his slow journey back to life. And for the first time in many months, Lily Carter allowed herself to believe that her own life might also be beginning a new chapter. Several days passed slowly inside Cedar Ridge Memorial Hospital as Daniel Reaper Hayes remained under careful observation. The first night after surgery had been difficult, but the doctors continued to report steady progress. The bullet had caused serious damage, but it had missed his heart and several major arteries by a small but life-saving margin. For the riders who waited in the hospital lobby each day, that small margin felt like a miracle. Lily Carter returned to the hospital every morning. At first, she waited quietly in the same chair near the wall where she had sat during the long night of surgery. The hospital staff gradually grew familiar with her presence. One of the nurses even brought her a cup of hot chocolate on the third morning after noticing how patiently she waited without ever asking for anything. The group of Hells Angels riders came and went throughout the week, each stopping by the hospital whenever they could. Their motorcycles filled the parking lot so often that the hospital security guard eventually greeted them with a respectful nod each time they arrived. The entire town of Cedar Ridge slowly learned about what had happened behind the bar that night. At first, the story spread quietly between neighbors and store owners. Then the local newspaper published a short article describing how a biker had stepped in front of a gun to protect a homeless teenager. The story surprised many people who had spent years assuming that men, like Daniel Hayes, only brought trouble into town. But the truth was now impossible to ignore. On the 5th day after the surgery, the doctor finally allowed Daniel to receive visitors for a short time. The older rider who had been present in the alley was the first to enter the hospital room. When he stepped inside, he found Daniel awake, but still weak from the injury. The two men spoke quietly for several minutes. When the older rider stepped back into the hallway, he looked toward Lily and nodded. She hesitated for a moment before walking slowly toward the door. Inside the room, Daniel lay resting against several pillows while the soft sound of medical monitors filled the air. His face still looked pale, but his eyes were open and alert. When Lily stepped inside, he turned his head slightly and recognized her immediately. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Lily stood beside the bed, holding the straps of her backpack with nervous hands. Finally, she took a breath and thanked him for saving her life. Daniel listened quietly. Then he gave a slow nod as if her gratitude did not surprise him. His voice was still rough, but steady when he answered. He told her that no young person should ever have to face danger alone. Lily felt the same tight emotion return to her chest that she had felt in the alley. She told him that she wanted to change her life and find a safer path forward. Daniel studied her expression carefully before speaking again. He said that everyone deserved another chance if they were willing to take it. When Lily left the hospital room that afternoon, she stepped outside into the sunlight with a quiet sense of purpose she had not felt in a very long time. The riders waited near their motorcycles in the parking lot, and the older biker gave her a small approving nod when she approached. The road ahead would not be easy, but the events of that night had changed everything. Daniel Reaper Hayes had survived the bullet that was meant for her. And because of that choice, Lily Carter now had the chance to build a future that might never have existed if one man had not decided to stand his ground in a dark alley.